In 2010, shortly after the Utopia crossover hit up some of the Marvel books of the time, I stopped reading single monthly issues of comics. This was a long time coming, as I was sick and tired of getting a sixth of a story once a month, and I knew that if I was going to keep reading comics, I wanted to get something that more closely resembled an air quotes complete story than something that was only a fragment of a story. Now, this is still not a completely perfect system, as if you have a creator on a series for a long time, take, for example, Ed Brubaker during his run on Captain America, I would personally rather read his whole run together as one really long, thousands of pages long saga. So even if I was getting an air quotes complete story when I made the jump to trade paperbacks and graphic novels, I still wasn't completely avoiding the fragmented part of a story over the course of a long time thing that I was inundated with in single issues. The other reason I finally stopped buying single issues was because my local comic book shop closed down, freeing me from the dreaded day when I would have to tell those wonderful people that I was no longer interested in getting the 2 series I had narrowed my pool list down to. So when my shop closed down, I was done. I didn't buy another single issue after that. But even some months before my local shop finally closed down, I hadn't been reading the issues I was getting. This was because I was just sick and tired of the crossovers that were seeping into my once very standalone X-Men universe that I held so dear to my heart. Less than a year after the conclusion of the Utopia storyline, we got something called Nation X, then Necrosha, then Second Coming, all within 1 year. It seemed like it was never going to end. I was not interested in reading certain X-Men books. If a book was poorly written or poorly drawn, I had no desire to buy it just because I was not going to be able to understand what was going on in the one X-Men book that I was buying if I didn't buy the whole story. Well, I guess you could say I've devolved since then, as I've become this mad monster who is incapable of not buying X-Men books. I have what a doctor would quickly diagnose as an insane desire to fill all of the holes in my X-Men collection. But after my comic book shop closed, I was not yet afflicted with this disease. In fact, one could even say I was getting tired of this franchise that I had held so dear for almost a decade. Well, sometime later, I started feverishly trying to get all of the X-Men trade paperbacks I was missing. I was even going after books that collected the single issues that I already had. And so I was slowly, very slowly, closing the gap between the X-Men comics that were coming out monthly and where I had stopped reading. In fact, I still have a tremendously long way to go, since there are so many core X-Men books as well as satellite books and minis that I feel the need to read before I move any further. So, long story short, after what sounded like one of the worst Marvel stories I have ever heard of, Avengers vs. X-Men, yeah, everything I've heard about that story sounds even worse than Chuck Austen or Peter Milligan's separate runs on the X-Men. Marvel more or less injected that feeling of newness into the X-Men once again. I am not quite sure when it really started, but for quite some time the X-Men just felt boring and static. We got surface changes like all of mutant kind going to live on the other side of the country, but it just never felt like it was really exciting. Well, after the events of AVX, we had exciting in the X-books once again. A select few former X-Men are now considered enemies of the state and are now on the run. Because of certain actions committed by one of them, they are now not only trying to save mutants, who haven't had it this bad since the Days of Future Past storyline set in the future, but they are also trying to atone for their actions. We have new people in charge. We once again have an X-Men franchise that is all about the conflict of ideologies, which, in my humble, is always what is most interesting about the X-Men. Maybe that's what's felt so stale and septic about the X-Men books for so long. There wasn't really any more conflict of the way things should be done, until Brian Michael Bendis gave us a new title called All New X-Men. Now, this whole conflict of ideologies thing is certainly present in other books, but I haven't read those yet, and I am not reviewing them here. So anyway, if you haven't read Avengers vs. X-Men, there is a very strong likelihood that I will be talking about the events of that book, as they are very crucial in the way certain decisions that characters in this book make. This really only applies to people like me who really do not like spoilers, so be warned that I will be talking about that book, though only in passing, as I am really only here to review All New X-Men Volume 1. Now that anyone who is afraid of the spoilers is hopefully gone, as you no doubt know, Cyclops, possessed by the Phoenix Force, murdered Professor Xavier near the end of the Avengers vs. X-Men story. Cyclops had been acting a little unstable and sporadic for a while before this happened, but this is what now sets him off as being just as much of a threat in the eyes of everyone as Magneto used to be, and is once again, as Magneto is siding with Scott during this book. One thing that I had trouble with when reading this book is that, aside from murdering Professor Xavier, it seems like the X-Men still have some fundamental issues with Cyclops, and I am not entirely sure what that is. I am sure that if I read the storyline called Schism, I would find out what it is that sets Cyclops away from the rest of the X-Men. But just in the context of this book, I don't know, and that would have been nice information to have. All we know is that Cyclops, almost in a state of panic, assures all of his remaining allies that he will set things right. We're not sure how he is going to do this either, or why he thinks the rest of the X-Men are not capable of doing what he wants to do. Again, it would have been nice if we had some specifics here. What exactly does Cyclops plan to do? Saying he will set things right is just way too vague for my taste. Anyway, we see Cyclops has now set up base in the former headquarters of Weapon X, which, for those of you who may not know, is the place where a sect of the Canadian government experimented on Wolverine among other mutants. This is just inspired, and is one of the things that I really love about this book. If you are only used to the X-Men of the films, or any of the cartoons, or even if you were an avid fan of the X-Men for about a decade, but you just stopped, then this book will throw things at you that are slightly different, but not exactly altered, just kind of tweaked a little. Cyclops turning the former Weapon X base into a headquarters is just a cool idea in my opinion. As we see in this book, it is basically illegal to be a mutant basically anywhere in the world, thanks no doubt to the actions of Cyclops and his allies from Avengers vs. X-Men. So even though we've been seeing posters across the internet ever since Grant Morrison's X-Men saying Magneto was right, it now seems like he really was right. It only took something like 50 years of stories, but humanity has finally gone to a place that isn't that far removed from the world we saw in Days of Future Past. Human cops have arrested a young boy who healed someone who was dead and brought them back to life. He committed no crime, and he was arrested for helping. Yeah, despite me not being that much of a Cyclops fan at all, really, it is very telling that he isn't entirely wrong. While I wasn't much of a fan of the idea of us versus them that was prevalent in the X-Men comics pretty much since Messiah Complex, in this new status quo for the X-Men, it really is mutants versus humans. The non-runaway X-Men are angry at Cyclops' tactics. They claim that every time he attacks a convoy of humans who are transporting a mutant prisoner, he is making things worse for mutants. And they're not entirely wrong either. This is what makes X-Men so interesting, when you have two diametrically opposed groups of people and they're both kinda right and they're kinda wrong. And although I feel like I should reiterate that I am not a fan of Cyclops, he is at least doing something. The only one of the non-fugitive team of X-Men who actually gets off his butt and takes action is Cyclops' childhood friend Beast. And that brings me to the real crux of this book. Beast thinks that he is dying, and he wants his life to have some meaning other than all of the things he has done. So he goes back in time to the days when the original 5 X-Men were still teenagers. Specifically, he goes back to circa the events of X-Men issue 8 from 1964. This is a very telling place for Bendis and Beast to choose to go back to. In this issue, Beast briefly quit the team because of the less than enthusiastic response from a human mob who tried to kill him and Iceman. This is a nice parallel that Bendis is making with what is going on in the present-day X-Men books. Cyclops has basically abandoned the rest of the X-Men and, in their eyes, is a full-on supervillain. And yet, in issue 8 of the original X-Men title, Beast quit the team and even appeared to be working with the villain of the piece, Eunice the Untouchable. It's definitely a neat idea, and it isn't slapping you in the face with it. It's there if you want to see it, but it isn't so overblown that it is hamming it up for those who don't really care. Anyway, Beast, adult Beast that is, he thinks he's dying, and so he wants to really mess with adult Cyclops' head. So he intends to kidnap the original 5 X-Men, bringing them to the future and showing Cyclops, hey, this is how far you've fallen. You are a failure. Look at what you once wanted to be, and look at what you are now. And then he wants to take these kids back to their own time, where he knows that Charles Xavier from the past, who was away on personal business at the time that Beast kidnapped them, will come back and brainwipe the kids of their experiences in the future. Well, things get out of hand pretty quickly, as you might have guessed. For one, Beast's plan kinda sorta works. These kids go off on their own to confront Cyclops while he is trying to recruit another kid for his new Weapon X school. I'm actually not at all sure how the original 5 X-Men knew where to find adult Cyclops, but oh well. And this really freaks out Cyclops. But the problems occur when Teen Jean Grey's telepathy kicks in a full year earlier than what it was supposed to for her. And then, after Teen Beast saves adult Beast's life, the team, with the exception of Teen Warren, unanimously decides that they want to stay in the future. Honestly, this is where the book lost me just a tad. I only read this book 2 days ago, and I cannot tell you for what reason exactly these guys wanted to stay, other than that is the premise of this book. The original Teen X-Men in the present day, acclimating and adjusting, becoming different characters than they would have if they had stayed in the past. So yeah, I wish we could have had a slightly better reason for these guys to stay in the present day other than because we have to. If their reasoning was we want to fix things, then surely even these kids who may not be as science fiction aficionados, surely even they would know that they can change the future by returning to the past. All they have to do is not let Charles Xavier know that they went to the future, which, now that I think of it, may be easier said than done. But hey, if a group of humans were able to sneak up on the world's greatest telepath and beat him nearly to death, then surely his own students can keep a little time travel secret, right? This book is more or less just set up for what I imagine will be a very long, very bulky run for Brian Michael Bendis on the X-Men. At the end of the book, we see a short little document that was written before the end of Avengers vs. X-Men, where Bendis is talking about what he'd like to accomplish in this series. He even goes so far as to say that eventually, Cyclops and his fugitive Weapon X-Men will spin off into their own book, the third iteration of the Uncanny X-Men, while the Teen Team will be the focus of all new X-Men. This is something I have a little bit of an issue with. I don't mind there being multiple X-Men titles, and if I did, well, I'd have been complaining for as long as I've been reading comics. But if a single writer is writing the adventures of 2 groups of X-Men, and it all stems from a single title, I really wish he would have just kept Adult Cyclops and the Weapon X-Men in this book. This would have made things at least 100 times easier for fans who are not reading the single issues as they come out. I have no idea when Bendis' version of Uncanny X-Men will split from the events of all new X-Men, and if all of Bendis' X-Men material was happening in one single title, it would have been easier for me to keep up with. All I would have to do is read those volumes in numerical order. You might say that this would be too much to keep up with in one title, but it really wouldn't be. In fact, it'd be as much to keep up with as if you were reading 2 titles at once. This isn't necessarily a problem now, but I suspect it definitely will be in a few months when I am trying to figure out what order to read the Uncanny and All New trades. But yeah, this book is almost entirely set up, and while that would ordinarily bother me, there really is a whole lot to set up, so it feels justified that this series takes 5 issues to really set in the status quo for this series. And that won't bother me nearly as much as long as we get plenty of material to keep us busy with each storyline that is collected. And unlike Brian Michael Bendis' Ultimate Spider-Man, which was very hit or miss with me, this book is dealing with numerous characters, and so while each issue might feel very light on story that is happening, each issue is absolutely filled to the rim with characters getting great moments. Where, if this was Ultimate Spider-Man, even though each issue also had character moments, I could always think of ways that the exact same thing could have been done in fewer issues. I don't get that feeling here, though that could easily change in the near future, knowing how Bendis writes. Considering how hit or miss Bendis is with me, I was iffy on whether or not I would like this. The hype I had been hearing for this series made it sound very good, and it did not disappoint. There are a few issues that I've mentioned, but after finishing this book, I was wanting the next volume immediately, and it won't even be available until June. So yeah, that's my thoughts. I recommend it to one and all. If you've never read an X-Men book before, I think this is mostly a great jumping on point. It was for me, and I haven't read a new story in a long time before this came out. If you are a hardcore X-Men fan and you haven't read this book, you might not like the direction some of the characters have been taken, or you might not like the premise, as you are not sure how long this can keep going and how it will end. But I would still recommend you give it a shot, though if you are a hardcore X-Men fan, I'd be more wary if I were you going in. I hope this video found you well, and if it did, I hope you will all like, subscribe, and share this video, and wait for more great stuff from me in the future.